Hello everybody, today is the first game of the MTG EDH Summer League Online. So let's take a look at the starting hands and commanders. First up we have TRGMorty running Marrow-Gnawer with a starting hand of 3 swamps, 2 rat colonies, an Inkai Servant of Oni, and a Bad Moon. Next up is Rallen running Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker, running with a starting hand of a swamp, a Blood Artist, Pilgrim's Eye, Grave Pact, Heap Doll, Diabolic Intent, and Nykthos, Shrine to Ninx. Next up, we have the TheLethargicShrew running the partner pairing of Vial Smasher the Fierce and Thrasios, Triton Hero, with a starting hand of a Rattleclaw Mizzet, Sheltered Thicket, Breeding Pool, Thermo Alchemist, Rakdos Shrine, and an Island. And lastly, we have AndyBigB running Marisi Breaker the Coil, who did not take a screenshot of their starting hand. Let's get started. At the start of the game, TRGMorty goes first with the highest roll, starting off the game playing a Swamp. The TheLethargicShrew opts to play a Breeding Pool, entering tap instead of shocking it in for his land for turn. AndyBigB plays Myriad Landscape tapped and passes his turn. Rallen plays a Swamp and with a turn 1 play ends up playing Heap Doll. TRGMorty plays a Swamp, tapping 2 to play a Rat Colony. The TheLethargicShrew plays an Exotic Orchid, tapping 2 to play a Fellwar Stone. AndyBigB plays a Mountain for turn, and ends up passing without having anything to play. Rallen plays an additional Swamp, tapping 2 to play a Lightning Greaves. He attempts to equip it to the Heap Doll. He then goes to combat and hits the TheLethargicShrew for 1. He passes his turn. TRGMorty plays another Swamp for turn. And tapping 2 plays an additional Rat Colony. He goes to combat and swings at AndyBigB because he has no blockers. As the players try to figure out the math on how much damage was taken, he passes the turn, eventually getting the amount of damage correct. TheLethargicShrew plays Llanowar Wastes for his land per turn. Until he eventually realizes that in order to morph a card, he needs to pay 3. So instead of floating 1 unnecessary mana, he opts to take back the Llanowar Wastes and play a tapped land instead, in the form of a Sheltered Thicket, tapping out the rest of his mana to play the morph card. He then passes his turn. AndyBigB plays a Plains for his land. Tapping out to crack his Myriad Landscape. He opts to find 2 forests. Rallen plays Nykthos, Shrine to Ninx for his land for turn, tapping out to play a Pilgrim's Eye to search his library for a basic land, which ends up being a Swamp, and he puts it in hand. He attaches his Lightning Greaves to the newly added Flyer and opts to go to combat, hitting TRGMorty for 1, and Heapdall going to AndyBigB for 1. TRGMorty plays yet another swamp for his land per turn. Tapping 2, he plays a Bad Moon, giving his black creatures +1/+1. He taps an additional 2 for yet another rat colony. He goes to combat. 1 rat colony at Rallen and another one at AndyBigB. Once again, the players have to do some math to figure out how much damage they're taking. He then passes his turn. TheLethargicShrew plays Llanowar Waste once again for his land per turn. Tapping 2, he reveals his morph, which ends up being a Rattleclaw Mystic, adding 3 mana to his mana pool. With 2 of those mana, he plays Thrasios, Triton Hero, his commander. Still floating 1 from the Rattleclaw Mystic, he ends up tapping 2 additional lands to play his other commander, Vial Smasher the Fierce. AndyBigB plays a land for turn, tapping 4 for Fumiko the Lowblood. He then passes his turn. Rallen plays a swamp for turn, tapping out to play Grave Pact. He then swings the Flyer at AndyBigB for 1 additional damage, as well as the Heapdall. He then passes his turn. TRGMorty plays yet another swamp, tapping out for his commander, Marrow-Gnawer. He then goes to combat. He opts to swing 1 rat colony at each of the players. All 3 of them end up taking the damage, having to figure out the math once again. Eventually, they figure out how much damage they're meant to take, and TRGMorty ends up passing his turn. TheLethargicShrew plays an island for his land for turn. As he tries to figure out how he wants to tap his lands. plays a Thermo Alchemist for 2 of those tapped lands. He then goes to combat, swinging out. And then passing his turn. AndyBigB plays a plains for his land for turn. He taps 3 mana to play Beast Within on the Grave Pact. In response, Bruce sacrifices Heaptall, exiling AndyBigB's 1 card in graveyard to the Grave Pact, and due to that, everyone must sacrifice 1 creature. Rallen creates a beast due to the Beast Within. AndyBigB goes into the Think Tank here to use his remaining 3 mana. Eventually, after some finicking with his lands, he will be playing a card. Eventually. He plays a Shiny Impetus on one of the 2 rat colonies. And with this, he will eventually pass his turn. Rallen taps out, playing his commander, attaching his Lightning Greaves to it. He then opts to not attack and just pass his turn. TRGMorty plays a swamp for his land per turn. And before playing anything, opts to just go straight into combat. Swinging 1 rat colony that's goaded at the TheLethargicShrew and the other at AndyBigB. AndyBigB creates a treasure due to the goated rat colony attacking, and ends up taking the damage. But before damage, TRGMorty ninjutsus out Inkai's Servant of Oni. Still tapped and attacking AndyBigB. After some finicking, we believe the hit occurs, so AndyBigB will give his creature in graveyard to TRGMorty. But retroactively, the TheLethargicShrew has a response, so this ends up not mattering. TheLethargicShrew taps 3 to play a Rakdos, or 2 to tap a Rakdos. To play a Rakdos from exiling all cards from target player's graveyard, which ends up being AndyBigB. So the creature does not return to play, it is instead exiled. After this combat, TRGMorty ends up just passing his turn. TheLethargicShrew plays a forest for land per turn. After tapping 2 to play a Talisman of Creativity. He then rolls for Vial Smasher, and AndyBigB is the unlucky victim. Just kidding, this one was for TRGMorty. He was going to tap Thermo Alchemist in response to his artifact, not realizing that Thermo Alchemist does not untap on artifact play. So instead, he opts to go to combat instead, swinging 2 at AndyBigB, or his 2 creatures at AndyBigB, taking 3 damage. And then he just ends up passing his turn to Andy. Andy plays a forest for his land for turn. And then taps 3 to play Cultivate, revealing 2 land cards, one coming to battle play tapped, and the other one to his hand. He opts to put a mountain into play tapped, and brings a plains to his hand. With his remaining mana from his lands and the treasure, he will tap out to play his commander, Marisi. Rather nearly tap out. He then passes his turn to Rallen. Rallen plays a Buried Ruin for his land for turn. He then attacks with Pilgrim's Eye. After TRGMorty takes the 1 damage in his second main phase, he plays a Diabolic Intent on the Pilgrim's Eye, sacrificing it to find a card and putting it into his hand. After some debating, Rallen finally lands on what card he wants. tapping out, he plays Yawgmoth, which comes into play. On his end step, due to his commander's trigger, he'll return Pilgrim's Eye, searching for a land and putting into his hand. He then passes his turn. TRGMorty plays a swamp for his land for turn. He then taps 5 to play his coat of arms. After no responses, it stays on the board. He then taps 2 more to play an additional rat colony. Before heading to combat, he uses his commander's tap ability, sacrificing the new rat colony, eventually figuring out that he will be creating 3 1/1 rats. Eventually. Rat colony is then sacrificed, and due to his coat of arms, he will draw 1 additional card. That was a lie, my apologies. Instead, he opts to go to combat, swinging the rat colony and the ninja rat at the TheLethargicShrew. After a large debate of trying to add up how much math there is on the board for the number of rats, Bad Moon, and the rat colony's additional damage, the board eventually finds out that TheLethargicShrew is dead to this attack due to the shiny impetus that AndyBigB attached. So he is dead by 1 damage. So we will skip ahead past a lot of the debate on how much damage was taken there and some silly responses. However, on TRGMorty's end step, Rallen uses his Yawgmoth to sacrifice Pilgrim's Eye, putting a -1/-1 counter on one of the rats, and then the Pilgrim's Eye returns to play and Rallen puts a land into his hand. TRGMorty then passes the turn to AndyBigB. AndyBigB eventually plays a Plains land for turn. In a bit of desperation, AndyBigB ends up tapping 6 for a Titanic Ultimatum in order to give his creatures +5/+5, First Strike, Lifelink, and Trample before going to combat. He then ends up swinging his commander at TRGMorty. TRGMorty ends up deciding to not block it, taking the 10 damage. AndyBigB heals 10. AndyBigB ends up tapping 2 additional mana to play his Bronze-Hide Lion. He then passes turn. But before doing so, Rallen ends up sacrificing Pilgrim Eye, putting yet another -1/-1 counter on an additional rat, and then returning it on the end step, and putting a land into his hand. Rallen plays a swamp for his land for turn. He ends up tapping 2 to play a Blood Artist. He taps an additional 1 for a Viscera Seer. And then taps out the rest of his mana to play a Sifter of Souls. Rallen then debates exactly how much he will be sacrificing this turn. He heads to combat, sending the Pilgrim's Eye at TRGMorty for 1 additional damage. In his second main phase, he will be doing some sacrificing Pilgrim's Eye and the Viscera Seer to Yawgmoth, putting 2 -2 counters on TRGMorty's commander and dealing 2 additional damage. He ends up sacking the Blood Artist, putting an additional -1/-1 counter on TRGMorty's commander, creating yet another Eldrazi due to the Shifter of Skulls. He then sacrifices all 3 to play a Phyrexian Altar. He then sacrifices his skulls and his beast to the Phyrexian Altar in order to play Feed the Swarm, destroying the coat of arms. He begins to kill off a lot of his rats, believing they die to the -1/-1 counters, forgetting he has a bad moon still. Eventually, he will realize that his commander is still alive. on Rallen's end step, all of his 1 attack creatures end up coming back. One of which is a Pilgrim's Eye, so he puts another land into his hand. And he sacrifices the Pilgrim's Eye once again in order to kill off Marrow-Gnawer, finally. The turn is then passed to TRGMorty. TRGMorty ends up tapping out here to play Kindred Dominance, picking rats as the only creatures left to survive. This in turn ends up clearing the board, but beforehand, Rallen sacrifices 2 more of his creatures to Yawgmoth to put 2 -1/-1 counters on the rats. The board is then cleared. TRGMorty first starts thinking he has to deliberate on who he attacks, and then he realizes he was goaded by AndyBigB, so he ends up having to attack with everything at Rallen regardless of what he wants. Once again, for one of the final times of the game, they have to try to figure out exactly how much damage he's taking from the rat colony, once again forgetting about Shiny Impetus actually dealing an additional 2 damage. Once they figure that out, Rallen goes down to 5 HP. TRGMorty then ends up passing his turn. But first, he has to pick out of this lovely graveyard of creatures, eventually landing on taking a Yawgmoth. TRGMorty passes the turn to AndyBigB. At this point of the game, AndyBigB and Rallen both feel that they need to slow down TRGMorty somehow. AndyBigB taps 3 to play a Norn's Annex, effectively slowing down both of his opponents to attacking him. He then taps 3 more to play a Salamity. He then taps 2 additional mana to play an Arcane Signet, and then passes his turn. Rallen taps 4 to play a Marsh Flitter to create 2 1/1 Black Goblin Rogue. He hopes that these 2 black blockers will slow down TRGMorty from killing him. He then attaches the Lightning Greaves to the Marsh Flitter. He then taps 2 additional mana to play a Spawning Pit that ends up being worthless due to the Salamity. He then passes his turn to TRGMorty. TRGMorty taps out just to replay his commander. He then goes to combat, attacking Rallen with only the rat colony. In hindsight, this is likely a mistake. He also attacks AndyBigB with his rat ninja, paying the 2 life required due to the Nox's Annex. He then returns the only creature in AndyBigB's graveyard to the battlefield. Rallen ended up blocking with one of his 2 Goblin Rogue. TRGMorty then passes his turn to AndyBigB. AndyBigB ends up tapping 8 mana to play Sandworm Convergence. This will end up being crucial for him to survive in the long run. He then goes to his end step, creating 1 worm. He then passes his turn. Rallen plays a swamp for his land for turn. He then taps 7 to replay his commander. He then sends the 1/1 flyer at TRGMorty for 1 additional damage. He then sacrifices it to the Phyrexian Altar in order to bring it back at the end of his turn. With this additional mana and tapping out, he plays a Big Game Hunter, targeting the Rat Ninja. He then also sacrifices the Big Game Hunter to the Phyrexian Altar in order to bring it back on his end step. Both the Marsh Flitter and the Big Game Hunter return on his end step, creating 2 more 1/1 robbing Goblin Rogues and then targeting the rat colony that is goated with the Big Game Hunter. The turn is then passed to TRGMorty. He taps 4 to play a Species Specialist. He then taps 2 additional mana to play another rat colony. With this rat colony, he ends up tapping his commander and sacrificing the 1/1 rat token. He, however, is only going to be making 2 1/1 rat tokens. but due to the species specialist that he picked rats for the creature type, he will get to draw one additional card. He then plays the swamp that he just drew for his land for turn, tapping 2 to play yet another rat colony. And without any good attacks, he ends up passing his turn. But before then, Rallen ends up sacrificing his big game hunter and the March Flitter to the Phyrexian Altar and returning them on the end step, creating 2 more goblin rogues and killing one of the newly made rat colonies. AndyBigB taps 2, playing a Hungry Lynx, which ends up being very funny. All the players have a good laugh talking about that card and its current state of affairs. It, however, will not be mattering for much of this game. AndyBigB then nearly taps out to play Marisi, his commander. He then heads to combat, sending the 1 worm at TRGMorty and ends up taking 5 damage. He then passes his turn. On his end step, he creates a worm, and Rallen ends up sacrificing the big game hunter and the March Flitter to the Phyrexian Altar, creating another 2 goblin rogues and destroying 1 creature, which ends up being one of the worms, specifically the worm that was just created. Also on the end step, Hungry Lynx creates a 1/1 rat that he ends up giving to Rallen. At this point of the game, Rollins is trying to figure out a way to close it out, specifically to kill TRGMorty and then dealing with AndyBigB after. He plays a Westvale Abbey for his land for turn. Tapping enough mana, he plays an Attrition in order to fully lock out this game from AndyBigB. He sacrifices 5 token creatures and tapping his newly made land to create a massive flying creature with indestructible and haste. And at this point, TRGMorty knows he's dead, as there's enough flying damage on the board to kill him on the spot. And with that, Rallen goes to combat, swinging exactly 10 damage at TRGMorty. And without any flying blockers and any cards in hand, TRGMorty dies. At this point, the game is all but over. Rallen can clear most of AndyBigB's board for the rest of the game, and he has no cards in hand. On his end step, he uses Attrition to destroy the creatures that he cannot destroy with Big Game Hunter, and when they return, he uses Big Game Hunter to kill the last remaining worm. Unfortunately, in the current state of affairs, he cannot attack AndyBigB as he has no large creatures other than the flyers, and Sandworm Convergence is not allowing him to attack with those flyers. The remaining creatures all only deal 1 damage, which, if he attacked with, would end up dealing 2 damage for each attacking creature back to Rallen. So he needs to get in additional damage with only his commander, the 2/2. AndyBigB has a fortunate top deck, drawing 3 additional cards with that Harmonize. But currently he needs to interact with the board in a fast way, possibly a board clear, as no creatures will be sticking back to his turn due to both the Big Game Hunter and the attrition. He plays a Urabask the Hidden and ends up going to combat, trying to attack with it. It ends up dying. He kills it by sacrificing 1 Goblin Robe to the Phyrexian Altar and then another to attrition in order to kill it. AndyBigB then passes his turn, and on his end step, Rallen once again flickers the March Flitter by sacrificing it and then bringing it back with his commander. Like I said, once again at this point, he is just looking for a way to finish off AndyBigB. Also on AndyBigB's end step, he creates a worm, which just ends up dying once again to the massive amounts of clear Rallen has on his board. At this point in the game, Rallen is getting frustrated with the amount of work he has to do to close out this game, even with his massive board, sacrificing some creatures in order to kill the worm. Rallen plays a mindless automaton, believing that it will help him close out the game. Not remembering Solemnity will not allow the counters to be placed on it, so it immediately dies. And on every end step for the rest of the game, it will come back and immediately die due to his commander. He then once again sacrifices March Flitter, bringing it back to make 2 1/1 Goblin Rogues. He then passes the turn to AndyBigB. AndyBigB plays a Soul Ring, which at this point in the game ends up not being terribly useful. He then taps enough for Gisela, Blade of God Knight, which ends up immediately dying. And once the Big Game Hunter gets flickered back, he kills the worm that was created on the end step. He also flickers and gets 2 more Goblin Rogues. Still just looking for a way to close out this game, Rallen goes to his draw step. Rallen plays a strip mine for his land for turn, which ends up not being terribly important this game. He then goes to combat, swinging his 2/2 at AndyBigB, taking additional 2 damage to attack. On his end step, he then creates 2 more Goblin Rogues. He then passes. AndyBigB plays a Canopy Vista for his land for turn. He then taps for Beastmaster Ascension, which once again ends up not being terribly useful this game. For the heck of it, AndyBigB taps out to play his commander, which Rallen immediately kills. Flickering back Big Game Hunter, killing the worm on the end step. He then flickers, creating 2 more March Flitters. Or creating another March Flitter, which creates 2 Goblin Rogues. Rallen does not draw anything useful this turn, so he ends up just swinging with his commander, dealing additional 2 damage and taking 2 for the attack. He then passes his turn. Andy creates 1 worm on his end step, playing nothing, which will immediately die. Except for the fact that AndyBigB plays a Teferi's Protection, and then Rallen just does it again, killing it anyway, due to the stack interaction. However, due to Teferi's Protection, AndyBigB is not able to take any damage on this turn. Due to this, Rallen just passes his turn, hoping to draw something that can close out the game next turn. AndyBigB top decks a land. He then passes his turn with Rallen once again killing the worm that comes out of Sandworm Convergence. He makes 2 more Goblin Rogues. Rallen, with a sigh of relief, finally top decks something that can close out this game. He plays a Blight Mound, sacrificing creatures, to gain enough life in order to be able to attack out this turn with 4 damage exactly to once again close out the game. And with that, Rallen is the winner. I would say his MVP would definitely be his commander.